The sun was dipping below the jagged skyline of Springfield, casting long shadows over the town's crumbling edges. Bart Simpson, 10 years old and forever restless, skateboarded past the usual haunts, Quick Mart, Moe's Tavern, the Tire Fire, until he reached the outskirts, where the abandoned factory loomed like a forgotten tumor. No one talked about it, not even Homer, who'd mutter nonsense about Duff experiments before changing the subject. The place was a skeleton of rusted metal and shattered windows, wrapped in rumors of missing workers and machines that hummed at night. To Bart, it was a dare too good to pass up. He kicked his skateboard to a stop, the wheels grinding against the cracked pavement. Spray can in hand, he slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence, snickering as he imagined the chaos of tagging El Bardo across the factory's decaying walls. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something sour, like spoiled milk mixed with rust. Cobwebs clung to every corner, trembling as if alive, and the faint drip of water echoed somewhere deep within. Bart's flashlight flickered, half broken, naturally, but he pressed on, his sneakers crunching over glass and debris. Then he saw it. A machine, squat and hulking, crouched in the center of the factory floor like a spider waiting to strike. Its surface was pitted with rust, but a single red button glowed at its heart, pulsing faintly, almost alive. Bart froze, his breath catching in his throat. Something about that button felt wrong, like it was watching him, daring him. "Come on, man," he muttered to himself, shaking off the chill. "What's the worst that could happen?" With a smirk, he slammed his palm down on the button. The floor didn't just open, it yawned. A gaping maw of jagged concrete and writhing shadows swallowed Bart whole. His scream cut short as he plummeted into darkness. The fall wasn't quick. It stretched endless, the air growing colder and thicker, pressing against the skin like wet hands. Laughter, high-pitched, warped, and not his own, bounced off invisible walls, growing louder until it clawed at his ears. His skateboard tumbled after him, vanishing into the void. Then, with a sickening thud, he landed. Bart blinked, groaning as he pushed himself up. He wasn't in the factory anymore. This was Springfield, or something wearing its skin. The streets stretched out before him, but they weren't pavement. They were soft, slick, and warm, like the inside of a rotting animal. Buildings rose crookedly, their walls pulsing with shallow breaths. Windows blinking open and shut like eyes. The air smelled of blood and damp earth, and when Bart stumbled forward, his sneakers sank into the fleshy ground. He yanked his foot free, gagging as strands of sinew clung to his laces, stretching like chewed gum before snapping back into the street. "What the—" Bart's voice cracked, echoing too loud in the stillness. He spun around, searching for an exit, but the horizon twisted, folding in on itself. Then he saw it, a figure in the distance, lumbering toward him. It had Homer's slouch, his bald head glinting under a sky that wasn't a sky. But when Bart squinted, the face was wrong. Empty sockets stared back, black and bottomless, and the figure dissolved into mist before he could call out. "Dad," he whispered, his bravado crumbling. He took a step back, and the ground squirmed beneath him, tendrils of flesh coiling around his ankles. They tightened, pulling, and Bart clawed at them, his nails tearing into the meaty surface. Blood, his own, oozed up warm and sticky as the tendrils burrowed deeper, fusing with his skin. He screamed, thrashing, until they finally released him, leaving raw, pulsating scars where they'd been. Above, the sky rippled like oil on water, and a massive eye tore open in its center. It was yellow, bloodshot, impossibly huge, and it fixed on Bart with a cold, unblinking stare. Memories flooded his mind. Every prank, every lie, every time he laughed at someone else's pain, playing in reverse, distorted, as if the eye was peeling him apart layer by layer. Bart clutched his head, collapsing to his knees in the quivering street. He didn't know where he was, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a prank he could skate away from. This was something else. Something that had been waiting. Bart Simpson knelt in the fleshy streets of this warped Springfield, his hands trembling as a giant eye in the sky bore into him. The scars on his ankles throbbed, leaking something thick and yellow that wasn't quite blood. He couldn't stay here, not with that thing watching. His skateboard lay a few feet away, half sunk in the pulsating ground. Its familiar red paint a flicker of normalcy in this nightmare. Gritting his teeth, he lunged for it, prying it free with a wet, sucking sound. The board felt heavier, slick with the street slime, but it was his ticket out. He kicked off, the wheels grinding against the meaty surface, leaving shallow gouges that bled behind him. "Gotta get out of here," he panted, weaving between buildings that wheeze and sag like dying lungs. But the faster he went, the more the air thickened, pressing against his chest until every breath burned. Then he heard it, a low, gurgling growl from the skateboard itself. He glanced down and his stomach lurched. The wheels were changing. They bulged, splitting open into mouths, each lined with jagged, mismatched teeth that snapped at the air. Before he could react, one bit into his sneaker, tearing through rubber and flesh. Bart yelped, swerving as a skateboard bucked beneath him. Another mouth clamped onto his calf, grinding bone, and he tumbled off, hitting the ground hard. The board skidded away, then turned, its wheels now mouse chattering as it circled back. "No way, man." Bart scrambled to his feet. Limping, his blood pooled in his shoe. The skateboard charged, faster now, and he ran, each step a stab of agony. It caught him again, teeth sinking into his other leg, shredding muscle until he collapsed, screaming as it gnawed up to his knees. Then, with a final snap, it rolled off, leaving him a sobbing heap. Through tears, Bart saw a familiar shape ahead. The Springfield Elementary School, its silhouette warped, the bell tower drooping like melted wax. The skateboard nudged him, its growl softer now, herding him toward the building. He crawled, dragging his ruined legs, until the double doors loomed above him. They swung open with a groan, revealing a hallway of twitching walls and flickering lights. Before he could turn back, the doors slammed shut, sealing him inside. The classroom was worse. Desks sprouted tendrils, thin, glistening ropes that lashed out, wrapping his arms and hoisting him into a seat. He thrashed, but they tightened, cutting into his skin. Then she appeared, Edna Crabapple, or something wearing her face. Her skin sagged, dripping like candle wax, and her eyes were gone, replaced by a black void that pulsed. She smirked, her voice a wet rasp. "Time for a lesson, Bartholomew." From a hole where her mouth should have been, tiny figures spilled out, miniature Barts, no taller than his hand, their faces twisted, eyes bulging, teeth too sharp. They swarmed him, clawing at his chest, peeling strips of skin as he howled. Edna raised a cracked ruler, pointing to a chalkboard that wept red. "Solve it," she hissed. Equations scrawled themselves in blood, nonsense numbers and symbols that shifted as he stared. The tendrils squeezed harder with each wrong guess, snapping his ribs one by one. The mini Barts giggled, stuffing his torn skin into their mouths, their laughter a high-pitched screech that drilled into his skull. Desperate, Bart scratched at the desk, his nails splintering, but the equations only grew more chaotic. He glanced out the window, hoping for escape, and saw it again, the giant eye now closer, its pupil dilating as if savoring his pain. The room spun and Bart's vision blurred. The last thing he felt was the tendrils loosening, dropping him to the floor as his body gave out. When he woke, the pain was duller, but his skin was a map of pulsing scars, his legs somehow whole again, rebuilt but wrong, the bones creaking with every move. The school doors creaked open, and he knew this wasn't the end. Something worse was waiting. Bart stumbled out of school, his rebuilt legs trembling beneath him. Each step a chorus of creaks and pops from bones that didn't fit right. The fleshy streets of this twisted Springfield stretched endlessly, the air heavy with a sickly sweet rot that clung to his throat. He was starving. His stomach gnawed at itself, a hollow ache that drowned out even the pain of his scars. Ahead, in the middle of the pulsing road, sat a giant donut. Pink frosting glistened under the oily sky, sprinkles glinting like tiny misplaced teeth. It was the kind Homer would kill for, and for a fleeting moment, Bart felt a pang of something like home. He limped closer, saliva pooling in his mouth. "Just one bite," he muttered, reaching out. The donut quivered as his fingers brushed it, and before he could pull back, he sank his teeth into its soft flesh. It screamed, a piercing, human wail that vibrated through his skull. Bart gagged, spitting out a chunk, but the donut pulsed, swelling inside his mouth. Its dough expanded, forcing his jaws apart, tearing skin at the corners of his lips. He clawed at his face, choking as it grew, a living mass that bulged down his throat, splitting his cheeks until his screams were muffled gurgles. With a wet pop, the donut burst free, tumbling to the ground. It sprouted spindly legs, thin and glistening, and its frosting cracked open to reveal yellow eyes, Homer's eyes, staring back at him. "Why'd you eat me, boy?" It rasped in Homer's voice, warped and dripping with menace. Bart scrambled back, his torn face bleeding, but the donut thing scuttled after him, laughing, a low, guttural chuckle that echoed in his chest. He ran, tripping over the fleshy street, until he crashed into a house that loomed out of the haze. The Simpson home, or a mockery of it. The door creaked open, and Bart staggered inside, desperate for safety. But the living room was wrong. The walls shimmered, made of glass that rippled like water, and his family stood there, Homer, Marge, Lisa, and Maggie, each a fragile, crystalline statue. Their faces were cracked, reflecting distorted versions of Bart. Sneering, screaming, crying. He reached for Marge, his voice breaking. "Mom, help me!" Her glass arms lifted, and for a heartbeat, he thought she'd hug him. Then they shattered, shards plunging into his chest, slicing through muscle and lodging deep. "You never change, Bart," she whispered, her voice splintering with her body. Homer's statue lumbered forward, his gut wobbling as cracks spiderwebbed across it. "Doe!" he bellowed, and the sound warped into a roar as his head split open, raining glass that slashed Bart's arms. Lisa's figure raised a saxophone, its notes a screeching wail that pierced his eardrums, blood trickling down his neck. Maggie's pacifier fell, and her tiny glass hand stretched impossibly long, wrapping around his throat, squeezing until his vision blurred. The reflections in their fragments laughed. Hundreds of Barts, mocking him as the cuts multiplied, his body a pincushion of pain. The house melted, its glass pooling into a steaming lake that swallowed Bart's legs. It burned, fusing with his skin, and he sank, thrashing as the liquid hardened around him. He clawed his way out, collapsing in front of a flickering TV. The same one from home, now cracked and leaking static. It flared to life, showing an episode of The Simpsons, Bart falling into the factory, dying over and over, each death slower, bloodier. An invisible audience roared with laughter, the sound so loud his skull throbbed, cracks forming in his head as his ears bled. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. The eye in the sky blinked once more, its gaze a weight that crushed his spirit. Bart's voice rasped out, barely audible. "Don't press the button, don't press." The screen went black, but his ragged breathing lingered, joined by faint, childish giggles that promised no end. The Reino dos Ciclos Tortuosos had claimed him, and he knew now. Every prank, every laugh, had built this eternity of suffering. There was no escape, only the next cycle, waiting to begin.